In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, the residents prided themselves on the sense of community they had built over the years. White picket fences lined the streets, and manicured lawns reflected the idyllic life everyone aspired to. But beneath this veneer of perfection, a dark secret simmered, waiting to explode. Ethan Grayson, a well-respected lawyer in his mid-40s, lived with his wife, Claire, and their 2 children. Known for his charm and friendly demeanor, Ethan seemed to have it all: a successful career, a loving family, and the admiration of his neighbors. However, he harbored a secret that would soon shatter his perfect life. Next door to the Graysons lived the Andersons, Peter and his wife, Laura. Peter, a software engineer, and Laura, a stay-at-home mother, appeared to be the ideal couple. But the facade of their happy marriage was nothing more than a fragile illusion. Laura was stunning, with striking green eyes and a magnetic personality that drew people in. Despite her beauty and charm, she felt trapped in a loveless marriage, longing for excitement and passion. It all began innocently enough. Ethan and Laura would often find themselves alone at neighborhood barbecues or community gatherings, exchanging casual conversations that became increasingly flirtatious over time. They shared a chemistry neither could ignore, and soon what started as harmless banter escalated into a full-blown affair. For months, Ethan and Laura carried on their clandestine relationship, meeting at motels outside town and exchanging heated messages that neither dared to delete. The thrill of their forbidden love blinded them to the consequence, and they continued their dangerous game, believing they could keep it hidden forever. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when the stakes are so high. Peter, always the attentive husband, began to notice Laura's frequent absences and the change in her behavior. She seemed distant, preoccupied, and her once loving demeanor had turned cold. Suspicion gnawed at him, but he couldn't pinpoint the reason for her sudden detachment. One evening, while Laura was out under the pretext of running errands, Peter's suspicions reached a boiling point. Unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, he decided to check her phone. What he found confirmed his worst fears: explicit messages, incriminating photos, and calls to an unknown number, all pointing to one undeniable truth: his wife was having an affair. Peter was devastated and furious, his emotions spiraling out of control. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and powerless. But the most shocking revelation came when he traced the unknown number and discovered it belonged to their neighbor, Ethan Grayson. The man he had shared countless beers with, who had helped him with his taxes, and whom he considered a friend, was the one betraying him in the worst way possible. Consumed by rage, Peter confronted Laura the moment she returned home. A heated argument ensued, with accusations and tears flying in all directions. Laura, cornered and caught in her lies, finally admitted to the affair. She pleaded for forgiveness, promising it was over and that she would end things with Ethan. But Peter was beyond reason. The betrayal cut too deep, and the humiliation was unbearable. Blinded by anger, Peter stormed out of the house and went straight to the Grayson residence. He pounded on the door, demanding to speak with Ethan. Claire, confused and worried, tried to calm Peter down, but he was relentless. Ethan appeared, his face pale as he realized the confrontation he had dreaded was now a reality. Hold back. He unleashed his fury, accusing Ethan of destroying his marriage and his life. Claire, stunned by the revelation, could barely process what was happening. She felt her world crumbling as she watched the 2 men exchange heated words, their voices rising to a dangerous crescendo. Just as things seemed to spiral out of control, Peter turned on his heels and stormed off, leaving Ethan and Claire in stunned silence. But the storm was far from over. The damage was done, and the ripple effects of this confrontation would soon lead to a tragedy none of them could have imagined. The confrontation left Ethan and Claire's household in turmoil. Claire was devastated, unable to comprehend how the man she loved could betray her so deeply. For days, she couldn't look Ethan in the eye, and the atmosphere in their home was thick with tension. Ethan, feeling trapped and ashamed, tried to apologize, but his words fell on deaf ears. His once stable life was unraveling, and he knew he had only himself to blame. Meanwhile, Laura was living in her own personal hell. Peter, though outwardly calm, was seething with rage. He watched her every move, his eyes filled with mistrust and contempt. Laura felt suffocated, imprisoned by the consequences of her actions. She knew she had made a grave mistake, but there was no turning back. Desperate to salvage her marriage, she cut off all contact with Ethan, blocking his number and avoiding him at all costs. But the damage had already been done. Ethan's attempts to mend his marriage were futile. Claire, consumed by anger and betrayal, filed for divorce, demanding full custody of their children. Ethan's world was falling apart piece by piece, and he was powerless to stop it. The affair had not only destroyed his marriage, but had also jeopardized his career and reputation. Gossip spread like wildfire through the community, and soon everyone knew about the scandal that had rocked Willow Creek. As the weeks passed, Peter's obsession with revenge grew. He couldn't let go of the humiliation Ethan had caused him. His mind was consumed with thoughts of retribution, and he spent countless nights plotting how to make Ethan pay for his betrayal. One evening, after drinking heavily, Peter made a decision that would seal all their fates. He called Laura into the living room, his voice eerily calm. "I want you to get him here," he said, his eyes fixed on her with a cold intensity. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. "Peter, I told you, it's over. I don't talk to him anymore." "Call him," Peter demanded, his voice rising. "Tell him you need to see him, that you want to talk. Do whatever it takes, but get him here tonight." Fear gripped Laura as she realized what Peter was planning. "No, Peter, please, I can't do this. It's over. Just let it go." But Peter was relentless. "If you don't do this, I'll go to the police and tell them everything. I'll make sure you never see the kids again." Terrified and cornered, Laura had no choice but to comply. She picked up her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed Ethan's number. After several rings, he answered, his voice cautious. "Laura, what is it? I thought we agreed to stop this." "I know, Ethan, but I need to talk to you. Can you come over? Please, just for a few minutes." There was a long pause on the other end. "I don't think that's a good idea, Laura." "Please, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I need to see you. It's important." Reluctantly, Ethan agreed. He knew it was a terrible idea, but the desperation in Laura's voice worried him. He told himself he would go over, talk to her briefly, and then leave. It would be a final closure to the mess they had created. Later that night, Ethan parked his car a few houses down from the Andersons, not wanting to draw attention. He walked quietly to their front door, his heart pounding with apprehension. As he knocked, he could feel the weight of his mistakes bearing down on him. The door opened and Laura stood there, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Ethan walked into the dimly lit living room, looking around nervously. "Laura, what's this about?" Before she could answer, Peter stepped out from the shadows, a grim smile on his face. "It's about you, Ethan. It's about what you did to me." Ethan's stomach dropped as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Peter, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." "Sorry?" Peter laughed, the sound hollow and menacing. "Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it." Ethan took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But Peter blocked his path. "You're not going anywhere, Ethan. Not until I get what I want." Laura stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. "Peter, please don't do this." But Peter was beyond reason. He reached behind the couch and pulled out a baseball bat, gripping it tightly in his hands. "You took everything from me, Ethan. Now it's time to settle the score." Ethan's eyes widened in fear as Peter advanced towards him, the bat raised high. "Peter, please, let's talk about this." But Peter's mind was set. He swung the bat, and the first blow sent Ethan crashing to the floor. Laura screamed, rushing to stop Peter, but he shoved her away, his focus solely on Ethan. Blow after blow rained down as Ethan tried to shield himself, the pain overwhelming. "Peter, stop!" Laura cried, her voice breaking, but it was too late. By the time Peter finally stopped, Ethan lay motionless, blood pooling around his head. Peter dropped the bat, his chest heaving as the reality of what he had done sank in. He looked at Laura, her face twisted in horror and disbelief. "He's dead," Peter whispered, his voice hollow. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, and he stumbled back, collapsing onto the couch. Laura knelt beside Ethan, sobbing uncontrollably. The man who had once been her lover, Her escape now lay lifeless at her feet. The silence that followed was deafening. Peter sat motionless, his hands trembling as he stared at Ethan's lifeless body. The gravity of what he had done slowly began to sink in, the adrenaline that had fueled his rage dissipating, leaving only a crushing sense of dread. Laura's sobs filled the room, the reality of the situation hitting her like a tidal wave. "We have to call the police," Laura whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "We have to tell them it was an accident." Peter shook his head, his eyes wild with panic. No police. If they come, they'll take me away. I can't go to prison, Laura. But what are we going to do?" she cried, her voice breaking. "We can't just leave him here." Peter's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. His eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything, that could save him from the nightmare he had created. Then, an idea struck him, a desperate, last-ditch effort to cover up his crime. "We'll make it look like a robbery," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll stage it, make it seem like someone broke in and attacked him." Laura looked at him in disbelief. "Are you insane? That's never going to work. Do you have a better idea?" Peter snapped, his voice edged with desperation. "We have no choice, Laura. It's either this or we both go down for murder." Laura hesitated, her mind spinning with the impossibility of the situation, but the fear of losing everything, her freedom, her children, overpowered her doubt. She nodded slowly, and together, they set to work, their hands trembling as they hastily arranged the scene. Peter grabbed a knife from the kitchen and pressed it into Laura's hand, smearing her fingerprints on the handle before throwing it onto the floor near Ethan's body. He overturned chairs and ransacked the living room, scattering papers and breaking a few picture frames. It was a pathetic attempt at creating chaos, but in their panicked state, it seemed like the only option. "Go upstairs," Peter ordered, his voice harsh. "Take a shower. Change your clothes. We need to look like we weren't involved." Laura nodded, her face pale and numb. She stumbled up the stairs, her legs barely supporting her as she made her way to the bathroom. She turned on the shower, the water scalding hot, hoping it would wash away the horror of the night. But as she stood under the stream, she knew that no amount of water could cleanse her of what they had done. Downstairs, Peter finished staging the break-in. He placed a few valuables near the door, as if the intruder had been interrupted and fled. Then he took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, and dialed 911. "Help!" he gasped, his voice filled with feigned panic. "There's been a break-in at our house. I think someone's been killed." The minutes that followed were a blur. The police arrived quickly, their sirens piercing the night as they descended upon the Andersons' home. Peter and Laura put on their best performances, feigning shock and horror as they recounted a fabricated story of a masked intruder who had broken in and attacked Ethan before fleeing. The officers took statements, their faces grim as they surveyed the scene. It didn't take long for them to realize something was off. The staged robbery was sloppy, the details inconsistent, but they held their suspicions close, choosing not to reveal them just yet. As the sun rose over Willow Creek, the neighborhood buzzed with news of the tragic event. The once peaceful community was now shrouded in fear and confusion as rumors spread like wildfire. Everyone knew Ethan, and the idea of someone breaking into the Andersons' home and murdering him seemed too horrific to comprehend. The investigation moved swiftly. The police combed through the house, looking for any clues that could point them to the so-called intruder. But the more they searched, the less the robbery narrative held up. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints or DNA evidence that didn't belong to the residents. And then there was the weapon, the knife with Laura's prints on it. The detectives called Peter and Laura back to the station for further questioning. They separated them, probing their stories for any inconsistencies. Under the pressure, Laura's facade began to crack. Her hands shook as she recounted the fabricated story, her voice faltering when the detectives pressed her on the details. "What time did you say the intruder broke in?" Detective Harris asked, his eyes narrowing as he watched Laura squirm in her seat. Around midnight, I think," she stammered, avoiding his gaze. "And you were upstairs the whole time?" "Yes, I was in bed. I didn't hear anything until Peter started screaming." Detective Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "Funny, because your neighbor said they saw you outside around 11 p.m., looking pretty upset. Care to explain that? Laura's heart raced as she struggled to come up with a plausible excuse. I went out to get some air. I was just stressed. The detective nodded slowly, jotting down notes. Right, and the knife with your fingerprints? How do you explain that? Laura's mind went blank, panic flooding her senses. She glanced nervously at the door, wishing Peter were there to save her from the relentless questioning. But she was alone, and the walls were closing in. We just need the truth, Laura, Detective Harris said softly, his voice almost sympathetic. The sooner you tell us what really happened, the sooner we can help you. Laura swallowed hard, her resolve crumbling. She had no idea how much longer she could keep up the lie, but she knew that if she broke, everything would be over. The pressure on Laura mounted with each passing day. As the police dug deeper, the inconsistencies in her and Peter's stories became glaringly obvious. The turning point came when forensic evidence revealed that the blood spatter patterns didn't match their robbery narrative. It was clear that the attack had been deliberate and personal, not the chaotic struggle of a home invasion. Under relentless questioning, Laura finally broke down. She confessed to luring Ethan to their home under Peter's orders, recounting the chilling events of that night. Her confession was the nail in the coffin for both her and Peter. The police arrested them on charges of first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. During the trial, the prosecution painted a damning picture of a premeditated crime driven by Peter's obsession with revenge and Laura's complicity. The defense attempted to portray Laura as a victim, coerced by Peter's threats, but the jury wasn't swayed. Both were found guilty. Peter received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, while Laura was sentenced to 25 years for her role in the crime. The verdict brought a grim sense of closure to the devastated community of Willow Creek. The once idyllic neighborhood was forever tainted by the brutal murder that had unfolded within its borders. Ethan's family, shattered by his loss, struggled to come to terms with the senseless tragedy. Claire, who had once believed she had the perfect life, now faced the daunting task of rebuilding it for herself and her children. As for Peter and Laura, they would spend the rest of their lives paying for the choices they made in a moment of rage and desperation. Their story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly love, betrayal, and revenge could spiral into unimaginable darkness. And as the community slowly moved on, the memory of that fateful night served as a stark warning of the devastating consequences of secrets and lies.